Hi everyone. Wicked. I think because we've been delayed a little bit, we'll get going. So first things first is just a bit of an agenda as to what we're going to cover off today. So the first thing, as I said, is just a quick introduction to myself and Tom, who'll run you through the session. We'll then give a really kind of top level view of the basics of a migration. So kind of covering off what even is a migration, what we mean by that, and kind of really unpick why certain migrations happen. We'll then go into some of the common mistakes that we found, both in mine experience on our current client sets, but also Tom's as well, based on our experience. And then the kind of key takeaways from the session. So the 3 tips that we'd definitely kind of pass over as successes to continue with. So the first bit is just an introduction. So I'm Laura. I'm a digital account director at Croud. I've been with Croud since about January 2018 even. So a couple of years. Been in digital marketing itself for 8 years. So covering both broader digital roles, but mainly in SEO for the past kind of five or so years, and very much had kind of client experience across travel, e-commerce, B2B, and finance, just to name a couple. And we've also got Tom.
Yeah, so I joined Croud at the back end of last year. I've been working in SEO for around about 8 years or so, on and off, and the majority of my experience in that time is mainly with retail and e-commerce, but also a bit of experience in both construction architecture clients and also B2B marketing as well.
Cool. So a bit of background into Croud. So we basically started as a PPC agency around 8 or so years ago, then kind of branched into SEO, and now kind of offer a full array of services within the agency itself, from kind of programmatic through to data analytics, conversion optimization, and also e-commerce as an upcoming channel for us as well. So a real kind of broad spectrum of specialisms we have within the agency. And really just to give a bit of background as to who Croud are and the model that we kind of work towards. We are a in-agency model that is supported by our network of Crowdies. So essentially what this enables us to have is in-agency talent, much like a traditional agency. So there's, as of the last figures I got, around 214 of us across the company in the UK, US, and Australia hubs, covering kind of around 22 nationalities in-house. And we're supported by what we call our Crowdies, so our Croud network, which is essentially an on-demand support of experts in a range of fields, from journalism to PR to SEO to analytics to translation expertise as well. And essentially it's a global network that we have and that support us as and when we have certain client needs or requests come through. We can have that expertise on hand, and that's all driven by our kind of proprietary agency technology. So we have a platform called Crowd Control, amongst other things, that enables us to communicate directly with that Crowdy team, but is also used for planning our client kind of deliverables, automation and campaigns. And we actually have 17 engineers within the agency that are solely focused on our proprietary kind of technical platform. And things that we live by is, having the scale, the right people and systems to deliver those results for clients. So that's something that we really stand by and is the foundation of what we do. And actually we're really fortunate that we get to work with really great partners as well. So a real range of clients from retail to finance, especially, and some of these clients we've actually already helped kind of with multiple migrations. So we'll kind of give a bit of experience as to how these clients fared, but also wider experience that we've had throughout the industry. To kick off, I'll pass over to Tom to kind of really drill into the basics of what a migration means.
Okay. So as I'm sure most people might already be aware, migration is a significant move of all or a part of a website to a new domain platform or combination there. I was obviously not talking about moving house. It's primarily about moving particular parts of your website either to new platforms or obviously combining maybe multiple websites that you have into one. We'll go to the next slide. So what are the different reasons to have a migration? Well, first and foremost, rebranding. So it can encapsulate things like changes of the look and feel of the website if obviously nothing else is changing. But, you know, particularly focused on rebranding. So is the name of the company changing, dropping a word, or are you trying to focus on something else? And then basically the two more sort of like common points around website migrations. So are you moving to a new CMS platform? Considerations to factor into doing that is the old one that you're using outdated, doesn't keep up with the latest functionality that's required, or perhaps just the contract is up on the one you have at the moment and you can find a more encapsulating platform. And then site absorption as well. So are you taking over a new domain? Are you moving your blog into a new subfolder? Are you merging perhaps multiple domains that you have and moving them into more of a subdirectory format from a subdomain format? And then if you're going into the next slide, so the different types of migration, CMS and domain, they are not mutually exclusive, so there can be a combination of the two happening at the same time. So CMS migration tends to focus on internal. That will basically encapsulate more things like being more development focused. URL structure does usually stay relatively stable around that. Domain migrations tend to focus a lot more on architecture and redirect pace, much more at the forefront of those. There's almost certainly going to be some sort of URL structure change that involves those, even if it's obviously just containing the domain itself. From a CMS perspective, it's much harder to monitor the impact across migration. And obviously, when you're looking at a domain migration, you know, things can be a lot more immediate. And then also combinations between those, so you can do partial migrations, absorbing one site into another one, moving, and as mentioned before, doing things like moving subdirectories to subdomains or vice versa, and also recoveries from previous migrations as well. So the anatomy of a migration, this is just a very small snapshot across a checklist that we have put together for a client that went for a website migration not long ago. So if not been considered before, obviously, when you come to do a website migration, we'd always say that meticulous planning should be at the forefront of that, laying out the steps that are involved, laying out the places that you need to go through. So do you need to check your hosting? Do you need to check your server environment? And this, like I said, if not done so before already, we'd ask you to obviously write down all the considerations that you'd go through, put them in a Gantt chart format or something like that, and obviously tick them off as you go through to make sure that all the aspects are covered.
Cool. And then, you know, that's kind of a small kind of snapshot as to the detail that we go into, but also we need to think of this in terms of a time frame as well. So traditionally you'll become aware of a migration, hopefully, you know, a year or 6 months ahead of when it's happening. And that's really when the planning stages need to happen. By planning, we mean, you know, taking stock of, you know, a bit of benchmarking, you know, where are we at right now and where do we hope to get to in terms of forecasting for it. But the main thing is also identifying kind of key stakeholders. So what usually tends to happen is, you know, there'll be kind of dev contacts that we need to be speaking to as part of, you know, the impact on SEO, as well as our kind of traditional client contacts, marketing or brand side. There can also be, you know, multiple agencies potentially involved depending on the scale of the migration. So whether that is outsourcing part of that development work, or whether it's a reskinning of a site, having the wireframes kind of being built out and the input as part of that as well. And one of the key things in the planning stage is to really define and secure that move date and make sure that is really clearly communicated across the board, that we can then, you know, start to plan backwards from. And then as we move from, the discussions around the initial benchmarking and working way to the checklists, 1 to 2 months before is very much the build up. So those wireframe reviews that potentially are happening as part of a rebrand are getting kind of defined and signed off. SEO considerations are kind of threaded throughout. So are we making sure that there's, appropriate copy on PLP pages, for instance, that will ensure that we get visibility from an organic point of view? Are we accounting for heading tag placement on the pages, and having those considerations as part of the migration, really signed off and agreed to with all stakeholders? We also then need to start identifying major pitfalls. So are we, starting to get access to a staging environment? Are the things that we've noticed are not fully where we'd like them to be? Are we having an influx of broken links? Is there an issue with some accessibility? Does the sitemap generate the way that it needs to? And really agreeing on that kind of functionality elements of the new build. And then really, again, what a theme that kind of comes throughout is agreeing on that no change date. So we're really kind of locked into working towards this date, and there's no movement outside of that. And then around a month of pre-migration, this is where you start to really capture as much data of the full site of the existing kind of platform as possible. So we really want to make sure that, as time goes on from when you first started talking around the migration, that we've got the most up-to-date and relevant information of a site, from URL structures and everything like that kind of accounted for, and taking that inventory of what our kind of existing footprint is on the pages that we're moving over, whether that be a full site or whether that be, like Tom mentioned previously, a blog as part of a subdomain move. And once we've got that, making sure that the redirect mapping is secured and locked in. So instances where we are moving, entire URL structures from one to the other, mapping those individual URLs and making sure that we're testing that redirect map as well. So in an ideal world, we have those redirects set up in a staging environment that we can then start to test, and make sure there aren't any redirect chains that potentially could cause significant issues later down the line if we go live with them. As we want to preserve as much equity from those original URLs into the new destination. And then, migration happens, and essentially that's not really where the work ends. If anything, it really starts to ramp up in terms of the immediate checks around broken links, making sure that, we've got status 200 URLs on the site and we're not having an influx of 404 errors, but also the monitoring starts from a performance point of view. So way back when we had the planning phase, taking those benchmarks of where we were from a visibility point of view, from a keyword point of view, monitoring that fluctuation and ensuring that from a traffic point of view we're also consistent. It's also worth noting that when we are in the pre-migration phase, making sure that all necessary tags and containers are also moved over. So when we have this monitoring situation, we can be rest assured that our analytics data or our search console data is true and reflective as to what's happening, and we start pushing through those quick fixes where needs to. And really the main point of why we've got so many considerations and need to really ensure that SEO is baked into any kind of migration planning is there's actually quite a risk in terms of traffic loss. This could be as high as 25%. It could be higher depending on how well this plan has gone or how badly it hasn't really been thought of from an SEO point of view. And it's really important to make sure that SEO is consistent. SEO may be, one of a key channel within your channel mix, and protecting that and visibility could be crucial to the profitability of a business, because essentially it's free traffic to your site. And if we start to bleed into that only means that, we're going to have to use paid activation to mop up that traffic that was once free to our site. And it also means we then have to invest extra resource into a migration recovery, which is a lot trickier to pull off than it is to get it right in the first instance. I'm going to pass back over to Tom to talk through a couple of the initial pitfalls and the kind of areas we'd call out to focus on.
Yeah, so one of the major pitfalls of website migrations is often failing to take stock of your entire site inventory. So large sites obviously do have, it's quite difficult to gauge the entire inventory of that website, but it is absolutely essential to make sure that, as Laura mentioned before, that you're really trying to account for not achieving that potential loss that you can have of traffic. Obviously, what you don't want to do is get into a situation where you're losing a significant amount of traffic and having to offset that against paid activity. So ensuring that you take an entire site inventory, regardless of how large the website is, obviously absolutely essential. Now, there's various different ways in order to do this. Basically, what we would recommend is that you obviously use a website crawler enabled to take stock of the URLs that can be found that way. So using something like Screaming Frog or SEMrush to gather as many URLs as possible from a site crawl in the first instance. Using your Google Analytics profile as well, helping you find the key landing pages that can potentially fall within there. And then also looking at Google Search Console data as well, and then basically compiling all of those down into one comprehensive list and deduping them, which should basically then help to see what you have on your website at the moment, and then obviously steps can be taken thereafter in order to make sure that you're accounting for all of those URLs if the structure is changing. And also quite a good tip moving it into a website migration. It's always a good idea generally to keep a blocked copy of your old website, just in the off chance that you're experiencing maybe some page loss from one to the other. You can go back and check some of the key pages that were on there, or maybe try and account for some of those which have been moved, which you can't find anymore. It's generally not considered to be a good idea to do everything at once. That's why we basically said at the start that really what you want to try and do is get everything down into a planned format, as Laura was running through before, and basically making that out and checking that off as you go through. So it's obviously really tempting to plan other sort of fixes as well. But this really should be the sort of central focus, and you should always be trying to plan for a section at a time. In the instance that you have an e-commerce website that potentially has product listing pages, product display pages, what you want to try and do is section those out and really try and look at them at a very granular level and make sure that they're accounted for separately, because it will make that process across things like URL mapping a lot easier. And also we've sort of dropped that last picture in there, if I can just get Laura to go back. Basically, it seems really sort of strange to sort of touch on, but the amount of times that we've come where clients have said, we're experiencing a loss of traffic, we can't find out why that is. It's always, absolutely essential to make sure that you go through the necessary steps at launch as well. So obviously making sure that you remove things like no index tags or disallows within your robots.txt file. It sounds really sort of simple, but you'd honestly be surprised at the amount of development agencies that would need to get the poke in order to do that sort of thing. So obviously making sure that steps like that are considered at the point of launch as well, absolutely essential. Probably what I would say is, in terms of traffic loss, one of the things that contributes massively to that is a disregard for placing appropriate redirects. So basically you want to make sure that you're accounting for all the different types of pages that you have on your website, and also what you consider to be your top performing pages. Now, this is from an e-commerce example that we put together from a website migration conducted earlier in the year. Now, this is broken down into the amount of entrances that these particular pages receive. So in just looping back into an earlier point that we made about doing things in stages, obviously what you'd want to do is try and prioritize by the types of pages that are receiving the most entrances. And the key considerations really, in order to make sure that you aren't achieving a significant amount of broken links that could lead to a significant loss of traffic, is what are your top converting pages. So that could be from any sort of medium within your channel mix, making sure that you're accounting for those that do drive the most revenue to the website, obviously in this example for e-commerce. The pages that receive the most entrances and clicks direct from Google, so obviously taking into account pages which get the most organic exposure, therefore drive the most traffic. Subsequently, obviously, depending on things like your conversion rate, they could be your top revenue earners as well. And another consideration as well is to ensure that pages that are linked to externally are accounted for as well. Now, you might not think that a particular blog piece on your website would hold much benefit if you made sure that link was not redirected correctly. But obviously, if that link has been placed on many external websites and is driving significant change to things like your domain authority, then obviously what you're going to want to do is make sure that's accounted for as well. So it's always generally a good idea to consider, as when you're taking inventory of the pages on your website through that step that I mentioned before, is always throw an audit across what your backlink profile is pointing towards as well. So using things like Ahrefs or SEMrush to make sure that you are accounting for those. And then also, obviously, more often than not, you would find that some of your pay-per-click performers, whether or not it be through Google Ads or it be through social media, they would often be, be flagged up if the pages weren't working anymore. But in order to make sure that you're consistently driving the revenue and keeping your conversion strong through those mediums, we'd always basically encourage you to make sure that your top pay-per-click performers have been accounted for as well. And obviously what you're going to want to do afterwards, if those have been redirected, is then go and change them in your various ad profiles and make sure that they're also pointed to the most appropriate page, basically just to maximize things like conversion rate through them.
Yeah, and then kind of one of the fourth pitfall that we've kind of alluded to at the start is essentially the time frame of the migration. So one thing that traditionally could happen is, movement on the end date of the migration if we're finding that dev are running late on some of the UAT testing, or we're not completely happy with how things are looking from a design point of view. Which is why we need to really kind of keep an eye on, what we're kind of banking as our final URL list, because this could actually change quite significantly, especially when we think to some of the larger sites that have quite a high array of inventory and turnover in terms of stock and product on the site. So in this instance, if we look to migrate in the middle of say October, we'd have roughly around 6k URLs, but actually if we push it any further later, we might have an influx of an additional 2,000 URLs that we haven't accounted for within our URL mapping, because things have changed and delayed. So it's always key to keep that communication open as to when that is scheduling to go through, and making sure that is considered. And in worst case scenario, this could take an additional 30 hours or nearly a working week to make sure that data's caption is also appropriately URL mapped and kind of QA'd and checked through as well. So it could have kind of significant ramifications as to the performance of the site post migration if it goes live without that awareness. And then the final thing is missing the post migration. So we've mentioned what steps need to be taken at top level before the migration, but post migration, especially the first couple of days afterwards, is really pivotal to the success of the site long term. Depending on the kind of scale of organic traffic you receive, this could really fluctuate as to what your level of normal is. So this could be around or just under a 20% reduction in traffic, but actually that for you might even be less. If it's 10%, is that really what you guys in terms of your client user base can kind of sit comfortably with until things start to fluctuate back to normal levels? But anything over 20% usually indicates a significant problem in terms of SEO, especially if you're used to seeing a lot of generic traffic come through to your site, and your generic organic traffic is usually higher than your branded traffic. If you're getting a drop of above 20%, then something's happened to the visibility quite significantly that needs to be investigated. And this is where you need to make sure that your reporting is really on a day-by-day basis, and not waiting for kind of week to day or even absolute worst month-on-month views to come through. Normally you'd see a slight fluctuation in quality score, but hopefully through the wireframe reviews and the testing and the considerations and talking through with your biddable teams, this wouldn't necessarily happen, but there would be a fluctuation. Whereas a higher priority would be broken ads. So, you know, there's redirect chains on the ads and landing pages that your PPC teams are using, and therefore that's having a knock-on impact as to how well they can really max out on their campaigns. As I mentioned, ranking fluctuation is normal, especially on a day-by-day view. And actually it takes quite a few weeks for that to start to level out and get a really kind of accurate picture as to how this new site is performing from a ranking point of view. So fluctuations, you know, around 3 or 5 positions of your normal is you know, expected, especially in the first few days where we're seeing Google start to re-index your site for the new kind of pages and URLs that are pulling through. Whereas a high priority would be, you know, you suddenly drop out of the SERPs. There's a kind of black hole created, and potentially this could be the placement of a no index tag that shouldn't be there, or no follow on certain links. This could have a significant impact. And again, you know, in terms of broken links, things are likely to break when you're migrating. You know, it's very rare that you won't have any kind of level of broken links, and around 5% is usually normal to have that buffer. Majority of links should have been checked through your UAT testing and your calling there. So minimal passover should have happened in the migration for things to break. But if you're seeing, you know, higher levels of broken links around the 20% up mark from, you know, recent calling and so on and so forth, that is going to have a kind of big red flag and needs the technical team and the developers to kind of be in constant communication with each other. And one thing that we really prioritize at Croud is during a migration, our teams are usually on hand. I know that our kind of head of director of web experience has done a migration recently that was around, I think, 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning, because we want to make sure that as soon as that site goes live, we get our crawlers out there and you know, understanding what the situation is in terms of that broken link piece. So that's usually why we really push for not setting a move date for a Friday night. It sounds like a pretty obvious conclusion to make, but it's surprising how many kind of clients really push for it, and presuming that, you know, maybe it's a lower traffic day for them, but actually that means that the likelihood of devs and everyone else being in the office and able to remotely kind of fix any major errors is going to be reduced. Which is why, yeah, we like to have as much of flexibility within the working week to be able to handle those kind of requests.
So, you know, we don't just expect you to take our word for it. You know, why is this important? Why are these pitfalls important to factor in? Now, what you can see in the graphic on this slide is a migration which Croud did assist with at the back end of last year, where every step that we've reported on was almost certainly considered. Let's just say the client's fairly blasé attitude towards URL mapping and redirects was a contributing factor to this. But what we did notice is that moving from September over a month to November, is that over that period when they migrated in October, is that they actually experienced a loss of just over 2,500 keywords that rank in positions 1 to 3, and that subsequently led to a year-on-year perspective loss of about 24% of their entire organic traffic. Now, you know, looking at that graphic, if there's people, you know, part of the seminar that thinks that might not look too bad, what I would basically say is that, you know, a 0.25% loss of organic traffic is definitely a serious consideration to go through. And also, with this being an e-commerce website, the revenue actually lost from not going through these steps correctly was certainly significant, and it's certainly taken a long time to build back up to that point now. So what you can see here is this graph stretched out over a wider period up until the back end of last month, where you can still see the migration there in October. But after some sort of pulling and pushing from Croud side into this client's development roadmap and also into the development agency, we were able to get quite a lot of the URL mapping originally conducted pre-migration implemented whereabouts 2 or 3 months afterwards, which obviously isn't ideal, but we are now seeing that we are now seeing those rankings find, you know, a much more prominent position. It's certainly not where it is, which there are other contributing factors towards, but obviously the steps that we wanted to go through in the first instance would have certainly helped alleviate the loss of those significant traffic driving keywords. So this is just purely focused again around the sort of URL mapping aspect, but obviously all the considerations and pitfalls that we've mentioned in this presentation could potentially lead to losses like this. And obviously the steps that we suggested going through at the start in terms of planning, making sure that those things are considered there at the forefront and also implemented either before or certainly at the point of migration, they certainly wouldn't have you know, led to such a significant loss for them.
So I guess in kind of recap and the key takeaways that we've run through is always have an SEO on hand or someone that is well versed, especially in technical SEO, that will have detailed knowledge of how certain decisions can have an impact on your organic visibility. This could have a significant knock-on effect, as we've seen on some of the instances and graphs we've shown. Just having, you know, an SEO input throughout the stage of your migration is really important to the success of it overall. Keep crawling your site. You know, there's always going to be new products, new pages, new instances of broken links or new internal links being created that need to be captured. So, you know, 3 times, 4 times, however many, and making sure you've got that backlog, and making sure that, you know, throughout the process you've got that level of detail to kind of reflect back on when you're doing your post migration checks as well. And then, you know, above everything really is mapping your URLs. So making sure that there is a like for like redirect in place, or if your page doesn't exist anymore, you've got the most appropriate link going through. What you don't want to assume is just because there's not a like for like page anymore that equity is just left on essentially on the old domain or old site, or kind of just, you know, not dealt with and funneled back into the new domain, because that can actually have, you know, some equity built up that will support the visibility of the site overall. So that's, yeah, a really key one to consider moving it throughout your migration. This was in essence, you know, everything we wanted to cover off. I can see that we've had a question through in terms of whether domain authority is impacted by a CMS migration. So it really depends what is going to be happening as part of that CMS migration. If it's no real impact to the URL structures, if that's remaining consistent, if there's the same internal linking setup in place, then there should be minimal impact to domain authority as a kind of metric, if that's what you want to kind of base the success of the migration on. But what is or needs to be considered is the kind of wireframe reviews, if there's anything that fundamentally is going to be changing the front end output to be considered. Domain authority is obviously a metric it's used in the industry, but it's essentially a MOZ driven metric. So I wouldn't put domain authority as the key factor as to pinpoint your performance off the back of the migration, but more, you know, looking outwardly at your traffic and your ranking numbers as well, as to how well that migration happens. We've also had another question, which is, when is the best time to take a snapshot benchmark of performance pre-migration, directly before? What I'd say is take into consideration the seasonality of when you're doing your migration. So it might be that month on month actually is fairly pointless for someone that is a travel company, for instance, that is migrating in October when they know that they have really high levels of SEO performance in the May time, for instance. So it's also having a year-on-year benchmark view of your migration plan and your migration numbers, but keeping very much a view of that month-on-month ranking visibility. From a traffic point of view, you need to have that seasonal element incorporated, but from your visibility, it's having a consistent view of how your split of rankings have looked coverage-wise in the kind of weeks and months before that migration, so you can see the clear pattern. But from a traffic point of view, consider the seasonality of when you're migrating as well.
Yeah.
Tom, I don't know if you've got any other kind of points to add into that.
No, only maybe just on the last question, also keeping that in accordance with any previous forecasting that you've done, either internally or with an agency that you work with. So obviously make sure that when you're looking at your performance there after the migration, that's also considered, like, where would you be at this point, you know, in terms of where you were forecasting previously. But yeah, as Laura says, obviously making sure that looking at where you seasonally peak is obviously essential to seeing what the impact of your potential migration could be as well.
So yeah, ideally you'd have a reporting setup in place that would give you that, you know, that view up until the day before your migration. So you've got that direct understanding of what's going to happen, you know, in the coming days. But that context of the year-on-year view is super important. So you can see any growth or kind of decrease on that.
Also, just separately to the migration itself, you know, when looking at post performance, it's also obviously important to factor in any sort of external factors as well, like potential competitive landscape changes. So maybe not just taking, you know, a loss of traffic that you see in places like GSC for gospel, and just trying to make sure that, you know, you cover all the bases like that as well before basically taking that back to your migration and looking what could potentially have come out of that.
Yeah. Are there any other questions that people would like to put in the chat? I'll give you a couple minutes if so. But as you can see, myself and Tom have put our email contact details on the screen. So if you do have any kind of questions or follow-ups that you'd like to discuss afterwards, then yeah, we can be reached on those emails. I haven't seen another question come through, so I think we'll close off the session here. Hopefully everyone found that useful and got out of it what they hoped. I'm sure that Croud will kind of distribute the detail around the topics that we've covered following the session, and will be a bit available to share across websites and LinkedIn's and things like that as well. So thanks everyone for your time, and yeah, hopefully speak soon.
Thank you, everyone.